First of all, a one-state solution is sort of meaningless. I mean, what would make sense to look forward to is a binational state. I mean, you got two separate communities, different cultures, different languages. It could be a multinational state. And that's a reasonable objective. I mean, I've believed in it all my life. But you have to make a distinction between proposing something and advocating it. Like we can propose that everybody ought to live in peace, you know, beat your swords into plowshares, let's all love each other. Nice proposal. But it isn't advocacy. It becomes advocacy when you spell out a path from here to there. Now, there is a way to advocate a binational state. In fact, one and only one way, as far as I'm aware of, and that's to begin with a two-state settlement. It has to be approached in stages. Now, there was a time when it could have been implemented directly. That was first of all, before 1948 it could have been, but since 1948 it could have been implemented in the period from about 1967 up to 75. And in fact, something like it was even advocated by Israeli military intelligence, but the government turned it down. During that point, it could be literally advocated. Israel was in a position to implement it. And there was discussion of it at the time. I wrote about it a lot, in fact. But it was absolute anathema, you know, bitterly condemned. And the reason was it was feasible. Now it's tolerated, in fact, encouraged. So you can read proposals about it in the New York Times and, you know, in the New York Review of Books. Why is it tolerated now but anathema then? Because now it's completely unfeasible. So therefore, it serves only to undermine what might be the first stage towards achieving it. So therefore, it's popular. Now, I'm not suggesting that those who propose it are trying to undermine a settlement. Of course, they're not trying to, but they're doing it. And that's why what they're doing is tolerated. You should think that through. Why was it anathema when it was feasible, but tolerated now that it's totally unfeasible? It has no support anywhere. It's not at all like South Africa. If you look back at the South African illustration is actually a good model, but you have to pay attention to what happened. First of all, Israel, under the current U.S.-Israeli policies, you know, Convergence Plus, Israel's not going to become an apartheid state. It's going to be demographically, ethnically pure. It's going to include Jews and kick out Palestinians, including those who are in Israel. So the apartheid issue will never arise. Furthermore, in the case of South Africa, it did make sense to, you know, have boycotts and divestment and so on to end apartheid. But that was after, first of all, because South Africa could not get rid of its black population. It's not like Israel. They're delighted to get rid of the Palestinian population. South Africa couldn't. It's their entire workforce. You know, it's, you know, 85% of the population. In fact, that's why South Africa developed the Bantustans. They wanted them to be viable because they needed them, and therefore they became an apartheid state. But even in that case, the protests against apartheid took decades before they developed. I mean, the major programs of, you know, boycott, divestment, and so on were actually in the 1980s. That was after decades of educational effort. It was at a time when there was nobody speaking in favor of apartheid. I mean, literally, it was gone. Congress was passing anti-apartheid legislation. The U.S. corporations were opposed to it. They wanted to end it because it's bad for business. And at that point, you could have boycott, divestment programs, which were in fact effective and important in kind of intensifying and dramatizing these efforts, and they had an effect. But the situation in this case is totally different. I mean, the South African model is just irrelevant. I mean, you can talk about a one-state settlement, but it's on a par with calling for everyone to live in peace. That would be nice too, you know. But what's the path to get there? Well, there is a path. It would start with a two-state settlement, which practically the whole world, including the U.S. population, favors. That would cut back the level of violence. It would set up circumstances in which possibly, and in fact I think likely, relations between the two states would grow commercial relations, cultural relations, commerce, cross-border, and so on. And maybe it would, as circumstances permit, lead to proposals for closer integration, which would make a lot of sense. But if there's another form of advocacy of a binational state, I haven't heard it. That's the only form I've ever heard of. And I think the appeal, which many good activists are entering into for a one-state settlement, is simply a diversionary force which is undermining the possibilities for peace and even undermining the possibilities for an eventual integration into a single state.